Today is the start of Women's History Month, celebrating the march of progress made by women from all walks of life over the past century. Last Monday was the 100th anniversary of the very first woman MP, Nancy Astor, taking her seat in the House of Commons. But for all the gains made, women have still not achieved parity with men. That's true here in the UK, even more true in less developed countries. And last week, the UN's human rights chief, Michelle Bachelet, said the threats to women's rights across the globe are real and growing. She said there had been a backlash and the resurgence of gender inequality narratives based on age-old discrimination. Do women still need to fight for rights? Helen Pankhurst, hello. Great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst. There have been extraordinary advances in the Western world since your relatives and those other brave women and men were fighting for women's rights and women's votes. Huge cultural and religious issues across the world, clearly globally, some of which we may go into. But in the Western world, what battles still need to be won?
So there's so much to say, very difficult to encapsulate it. But if we look at the issue of women's rights and unpick it to say, you know, how far have we got in terms of politics, both here and globally, 195 countries in the world, you'd expect some parity, wouldn't you? But there are only 3 countries in the world where you have the same number of women or more in Parliament. Look at any political...
Which are those countries?
3 countries. They are
off the top of your head.
Rwanda, Cuba and Bolivia, I think.
Wow, yeah. So
politically, we're still not there, you know, in any way. Look here at what the situation is in terms of the percentage of women in Parliament. I think it's 34% at the moment. Look economically, things like 50... richest people in the world, how many women? I think the current figure is 3 out of 50. Look at who is unequally represented in terms of the poorest percentage, the poorest people in the world tends to be women. So look at any aspect of women's rights, any aspect of women's lives, and there still is so much to be done. I'm not even looking at issues around gender violence, but that is absolutely pivotal to this issue. So yes, there has been progress, but this assumption that, you know, gradually we'll get there, absolutely not. There are many instances of where we're going back, not forwards, and therefore we still absolutely have to challenge the system, demand change. That point about relational issues, to me, that was made earlier in the earlier debate, to me, we change this by the agency of individuals, we change this by relational attitudes, changing social norms, but there are also structural inequalities, policy changes that still need to be addressed.
We'll address some of those. Ella Whelan, I want to talk about the Me Too movement as well. Harvey Weinstein, of course, this week is a massive game changer for many women. That's showing that what women have had to silently put up with. First off, though, do women need more rights in this country?
I think women need more freedom, for sure. And one of the key issues I think that women still need to fight for is their bodily autonomy. I think abortion rights have to be addressed.
I want to address that in just a few moments' time.
But that's a specific. But more broadly, what I mean by women need more freedom is that I think that the discussion about feminism over the last 10 or 20 years has centred around the need for women to be protected, to feel safe, which obviously sounds like a very good thing. But the interventionist methods, such as positive discrimination, quotas, 50-50 representation, or making things like misogyny a hate crime, all these suggestions of how we can protect women, I think is actually leading to us limiting women's freedom. I think if we really want to achieve better women's rights, and the discussion about rights earlier was very interesting, I think actually rights and freedom are different. To empower women and young women to be able to take hold of all the options in their life. I think we have to get back to a kind of, perhaps an old school, revolutionary idea of women as being just as rough and tough and strong as men.
So where does Me Too come into that?
Well, Me Too is a particularly difficult issue because I think any time you criticise it, it's like you're a witch saying that there's something evil and wrong about it. But I think the thing about Me Too is, while it started as the individual case of Harvey Weinstein, which I think most of us will be pleased he's got his justice, or the victims have got their justice and that he's been convicted, spun out into a larger discussion about not just sexual harassment, but sexual misconduct and behaviour. And it spread into this incredibly broad area of discussion of how should men and women relate to each other. And I think the end result is that, for me, we've had a lot of discussion about why women should be fearful of their interactions with men, fearful of going to bars, fearful of being in the workplace. And actually, I think a politics of fear is exactly the opposite of what women need to be free.
Brilliant. Shola.
I think it's important to stress
What's the patriarchy? What does the patriarchy mean to you?
And I'm going to get that, but I think it's important to stress this point, that there is no freedom without rights, and there are no rights without the freedom to exercise those rights, right? And you have to understand that what women have been fighting against, it's not just about rights to freedom. We've been fighting against this decadent and insidious mindset of a patriarchal structure that is steeped in positioning women as second-class citizens and the weaker sex. That has actually positioned every issue that has impacted women negatively, whether it's the policies from government that don't center women from an economic perspective.
It's interesting what she said about Me Too, if I may,
yes,
Shola.
and when we come to...
I just want to put one point, and I will come back to you, of course, and I'll let you, but what you said about the weaker sex, Ella's argument there that there are aspects of Me Too that makes women into the weaker sex and disempowers them. What would you say to that?
I would say that there's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, about the Me Too movement that disempowers women. I think that there are real conversations and nuances around it. The reality is that women are attacked, abused, harassed, and then when they are bold enough to raise their heads above the parapet to say, this is what has happened to me, they're then attacked as liars. So when the abusers are pointed out as, this person has done something wrong, it's the principle of innocent until proven guilty. But when it comes to women, it's the principle of liar until proven, innocent.
Ella, come back on that. I'll come back to you.
But I think the point here is to understand this, that women are actually working very hard against all these stereotypes. That doesn't disempower. It's not about empower. It's the fact that all of these structural systems put women at a very, very disadvantaged position.
Shola, let's get a response.
I think that the difficult thing is when you start talking about the patriarchy, for many people it feels like this kind of ghost that's floating around in the air that's just deciding to be sexist to about women. I think we can say that there are certain ways in which capitalism, for example, the way that capitalism works means that women are the primary people who take care of the childcare, and we can change that by, for example, having 24-hour state-provided nurseries. There are solutions to these things. But on the issue of women being the weaker sex, I think this is a really important point, which is that the reason why I think it's problematic that the conflation between very serious instances of rape and abuse and harassment have been put on a kind of spectrum with someone being unpleasant to you on a date or someone using, off-colour sexist language, is that what it's meant is that, and I mean this quite seriously, women are being encouraged to see everything as an affront and not differentiate.
Right
when
now.
it comes
I
to
think that's just wrong.
if you let me finish my point, when it comes to dealing with the serious issues around women's freedom, women's ability to act freely in the world without fear and without constraint, we need to assert that there are some things women can battle themselves and there are some things women can't. When it comes to
Shola, I will come back to you. I just want the audience think. Any hands up in the audience? Oh, there's a lady here who's shot up. And, yeah.
Actually, that word battle, I think the word fight is something that's so different in so many different circumstances.
Yes.
We in the Western world actually have the opportunity to work with the system rather than fight against it. My daughter has founded a company called She Writes, which is about promoting music, females in music, and actually has kind of taken all the stats. If you look at Vicky Bain's stats, about 14% of the women who are writers and 90% artists, that's a percentage in the music business when there's £8 billion to go along with it. So what she did was set this up and worked with the system and used the space that's available rather than necessarily fight it. Obviously, Malala has to fight. Malala has to fight.
Allow me to look at the workplace. Shola, I will be back to you. Likewise, Paul, I just want to find out about the workplace as well, because we've got Emma Revel here, Institute of Economic Affairs. There you are. The gender pay gap is there in black and white, isn't it?
If you look at the government-mandated reporting statistics, it's very easy to say, yes, the gender pay gap is there in black and white. This is companies with more than 250 employees have to publish their gender pay gap data. And some shocking statistics have come out. You're getting pay gaps over 50% in favour of men. But what those statistics don't do is they don't control for job. They don't control for background, experience, age. If you and I worked for the same company, Nicky, they would be comparing our gender pay gap in pure number terms. It wouldn't say that actually you've got a lot more experience than me, you've done a lot more things, and it's probably a fair assumption that you would be paid more than me in return. When you look at different gender pay gap statistics, you see much smaller gender pay gaps. You see that actually for the under 40s, so people graduating until effectively when parenthood kicks in, the gender pay gap is actually negligible. So what we're really talking about is a motherhood pay gap, and that's a reasonable thing to discuss. The penalty that women face as the gender that predominantly takes time off work to care for children. But I think it's important to consider whether or not that is a choice or whether that is a structural thing that women are the gender that are expected to take all that time off.
Rosa, come back on that one then.
The radical feminists, the second wave feminists fought so that there wouldn't be this sex pay gap, so that maternity rights would actually mean that women could go back into the workforce and not be discriminated or disadvantaged for having born children. But I look at my profession. I'm an academic and I'm a professor. There is a significant sex pay gap between the men and the women. So what do the universities do? They just give us a 7% uplift if you're a female professor to try and remedy it. There are only 25 black female professors in this country. So they're not even looking at the numbers of the women and how few of us there are, let alone the intersectional issues where it comes to black female professors. All they're doing is just upping with 7% and saying, we've now addressed it. If the public sector aren't addressing it properly, then why would the private sector address it properly?
Well,
we need to actually look at all of the inequalities which do come from patriarchy, because the systems and the institutions and the laws and the policies are designed predominantly by men, right, white men, and from the perspective of white men and for the benefit of white men. So we actually need to fight all of these patriarchal structures, whether we're looking at the sex pay gap, whether we're looking at abuse or anything else, and understand why these institutions aren't working for us as women.
I think that, you know, I don't particularly want to argue about the patriarchy because it's not hugely... there are different things you can talk about in relation to that. But the interesting thing is we've got more women in Parliament, for example, than we ever did before. There was the kind of Blair's Babes era, and now the Labour Party has a huge amount more women, and there's more of that happening. What has happened, you know, tangentially, in terms of change for women in politics? You know, abortion rights, I'm going to keep coming back to, is something I feel very strongly about. Something that you could change like that by repealing the Offence Against People Act and making women truly free in terms of their bodies. What Women in Parliament is putting forward, one or two, and the more women... the point I'm trying to make is it's not just about white men, you know, male, pale and stale, that whole argument. It's about what will an individual, politician or otherwise, do to make women more free.
So reproductive rights, let's talk about that right now. Are those battles we're talking about? Obviously, we had the situation in Northern Ireland recently when the Assembly wasn't up and running. We know what's happening in the USA. People have different views on this, very strong views. But is that a battle still to be fought and won in this country?
Absolutely, because men have always controlled women's bodies, right? Women have been the property of men from their fathers and then passed to their husbands, and they've controlled their bodies because of reproduction, because men want to have boy children to take over from them. This is our history.
Do you think what about the limit? What should the limit be? The abortion limit be? Do you think?
None.
There should be absolutely none. There should be no abortion limit.
It should be decriminalised so that the choice is for a woman herself and between her and her doctor.
There should be no abortion limit, and it should be up to the individual and the abortion provider.
Exactly.
Because there will be instances where a woman's life is at risk and her life might be threatened, she might die. So how do you balance the two rights? The woman is the living person. The fetus, until it's born, is not a viable human, so we have to look at the rights of the human being.
It's a viable human from 25 weeks.
Individual abortion providers might say that they won't provide access to abortion once the fetus is viable outside the womb. I think that a woman's body, a woman's autonomy and women's rights, we need to stop other people policing what women do with their bodies, and people don't understand that pregnancy and giving birth are life-threatening things, and people die around the world, including this country. Well, and again, black women's maternal mortality rates are much higher than white women's because of intersectionality. But we need to give women back autonomy and bodily integrity.
No limit, Sarah?
You mentioned about the backlash, Nicky, and about against feminism.
I want you to talk about reproductive rights.
Absolutely, because the reason why there's a backlash is because the women's movement has gone in the wrong direction. And I think that the idea of abortion rights is one of those reasons. Because obviously, a child in the womb is a separate individual. Its DNA is completely different. And with the women's movement and women's rights can only move forward alongside men's rights and the right to life. We have to move forward as families. We have to move forward as a community. We have to think about men's rights. A lot of the issues around mental health, and I've experienced them in my own family to a large extent, and homelessness, is that the family collapses when men are pushed out of their role as fathers. If a woman says, this is not your child, I'll get on without you, thank you very much.
Shola, I'm going to come to you in a minute with a specific point, but let's Rosa come back on that.
Women are not support humans. Helen Joyce talks about this. We are not support humans to men. We are our own people, and we have the right to centre our own interests.
Sarah, then Shola.
If you mistrust all the motives of men and take away from them their spiritual dignity to love and provide, and you mistrust everything they think and feel, how are you going to create the kind of relationships that actually help women to be strong and in their true spiritual power? Unless we have true spiritual solutions, we're never going to have political solutions.
Shola, what's your views
We've gone the wrong way.
What are your views in the arguments we're hearing about abortion, no limit for abortion? What do you think of that?
I'm totally pro-choice. So as far as I'm concerned,
until what point in the pregnancy?
So, as far as I'm concerned, it should be a woman's choice, and of course, she should take medical advice. And
they're demanding infanticide
please.
Let us
leave it. Let's leave it there. By all means, let us learn.
Could you let her talk, please?
Let us learn from the research. Let's learn from the lived experiences of women, the experiences of the medical practitioners. Let's make it, available. Let there be no stigma around it. But bottom line is women make that choice, not the government, not society with their perception.
Why not the father and the mother?
If the father wants to be part, of the conversation, let him be part of the conversation. But can I just respond to her point around
about
the women's movement?
Very important.
Sarah,
the women's movement going the wrong way. First of all, look, I grew up with a feminist father who taught me to spread my wings and fly. So you see, when women go out there and we are fighting the good fight for equality and justice, I'm sorry, it's not about fighting the fight that is excluding men. Men need to get over themselves. Join us or stay the heck out of our way. There are real issues here that need to be addressed. And part of the problem is the structural, as I said, the structural system that is steeped in positioning women as unequal human beings.
Let's get a response. Ella, and then I'll come to you, Helen.
The reason this is such an exciting debate and a positive one is that really for women's freedom, bodily autonomy is the litmus test. It is a case of, do you believe in women's freedom or do you not? And the reason why it's so important is, if you believe that a woman should be able to be in charge of her life decisions and her body and herself and her individual being, not her family, but her individuality, then all the other freedoms follow. It is the bedrock, the centre point. Autonomy and agency for women in abortion and elsewhere is the bedrock.
No limit,
why
no
don't you think that is disempowering women? Because we use your same argument around the Me Too movement. I can tell that this is very passionate. This is very personal to you. But I can see an analogy between the autonomy, the power of women over their own bodies, and the power of women economically, the power of women culturally.
I'll tell you why
you don't see that.
Very quick. I'll tell you why it's different very quickly, because the interesting thing is the arguments for limits on abortion at the moment and the arguments to stop that freedom for women is about protection. It's about safety. And that's why I think protection and safety and freedom, with all its risks and all its dangers, is the more beneficial thing. So if you believe in women's freedom, you have to believe in women's agency. And that means, Nicky, finally, just
take one and not deal with the other.
It means women's ability to, at the same time as be able to deal with the catcaller on the street, also be able to have the agency to make the decision about her
Well, you're
body.
minimizing talking about catcalling when they're real issues of sexual abuse.
I thought that word pankhurst might just get a little bit of hush going on in the studio.
Okay, it's amazing how quickly this becomes very emotional. It's about the centre of who we are as women, as men, the relationship between the two. It's about power.
But it's a very divisive issue. Time limit and abortion is a very divisive issue amongst women who are feminists.
Absolutely. And the thing is, at what point does whose voice gets heard? Who is making the decision about when and up to when the amount of the period that you have? Whose voice is being heard? And also, in these ideas about the role of men, I absolutely believe fundamentally that men as feminists have to be part of the debate. But if they're part of the debate, then if you criminalise, who are you criminalising? You can't just criminalise women and not understand that this is about men and women involved in it. But I also want to say that for me, it's about power and the inequality around men and women's voices right across the board. And if you take one issue, which I feel passionately about, and that's the link between gender justice and environmental issues, who is at the table in terms of making decisions on environmental issues? Is it men or is it women?
Is Greta Thunberg an environmental...
Greta Thunberg is a fantastic example of a feminist voice outside of those who are making the decisions. We need more young people, and we need more women in political spaces rather than campaigners. All these feminist voices, myself included, outside the political system is important. We're holding power to account, but we need power itself. We need the political system to be much more feminist.
That is about men. So we have to think about men here as well.
Yes.
And I think in terms of, so it's this, and this is what I think is very, very difficult for men to accept. It's very difficult to look at yourself and understand the power that you hold, the privilege it gives you, and that it isn't enough just to use your power kindly. You actually have to give some of it away, chaps,
right.
I'm afraid. And I think that
but women
it's very,
also
very
benefit
difficult
from
for
white
men
privilege,
to deal
don't
with.
they?
Women
also benefit from white privilege.
Of course they do.
Yeah.
I was talking about male privilege.
Okay.
So why are men committing suicide in greater numbers than ever?
Well,
why
because I think the way we construct masculinity does put a lot of pressure on men.
A brilliant debate, even though we say so ourselves, about males and masculinity in the last series, and we had a fantastic range of male contributors. I commend it to you if you get the chance to watch it. Shola, I want to take it to the rest of the world, to religious oppression, to cultural oppression. FGM, for example, it's women who are perpetrating that within those familial structures, aren't they?
I think people must understand that a lot of the oppression that has been imposed on women and the negative stereotypes that women experience is more than often or not cloaked in this interpretation of it being the will of God. No, and people use all kinds of Bible passages as an example. Or women are meant to be submissive. Or, you know, women, this is your position. Forgetting that one of God's key, the key commandment is love thy neighbor as you love yourself. Do unto others as you want to be done unto you. And if we use that as a principle, equality would not be an issue. At home, in government, in the workplace, because everybody will be treating each other the way they ought to be treated.
What about Saudi Arabia? What about Pakistan? What about those places?
I say the same thing applies. The same thing applies everywhere.
If you're a victim of rape, you're seen as the criminal.
But you know what? But that's the same here. No, Nicky, that's the same here.
It's not the same here.
No, it is the same here. When the victims are treated that way.
In Mauritania and in other countries around the world, if you are a rape victim and you do not have witnesses that you were raped, you will be put in prison for adultery or you'll be killed. And I agree with you. Here, what other crime is there where the victim's phone gets taken away, not the perpetrator, where the victim gets interviewed before the perpetrator? We might not criminalise under adultery laws the way we treat rape victims, but the way that we treat women who have been victims and survivors of rape is so different to the way that we treat any other victim of a crime.
You also need to understand, let's also understand this. I'm really done with this nonsense illusion that because women happen to, we were successful 100 years ago to get the right to vote, to get the right to access to our children when we divorce husbands, get the right to an education, get the right to enter a profession. And oh my God, women, you've done so well for yourself. Or you're here today. Well, we have some women in parliament, don't we? It's not enough. enough. The fact that we've done this does not mean it is enough. It does not solve the problem.
There are huge areas where women
I'm going to say nothing else for the rest of this debate.
That's okay. That's okay, Nicky.
Nikki, on your FGM point, women do perpetrate FGM against other women. There's 200 million women and girls. But why do they do it? Because the men say otherwise they won't get married. The men say otherwise they will be unclean. Right, so the women are victims of the patriarchy carrying out the patriarchy.
That's right.
And then it gets cloaked as women harming women without looking at that broader context. And it's the men saying they won't marry women who haven't had that mutilation.
I want to come back about the issue of women being naive about the way they're betraying women. And when you believed that I was being ridiculous about infanticide being campaigned for, but it is. Because once you disrespect the idea of a human life, and we know it's human from science and DNA and the intimate relationship between the mother and the child, women are betraying women into farms of surrogacy because they say that relationship isn't important.
Again, that's a personal
and that
choice.
17 million babies killed.
Born,
what about forced abortion in Tibet? What feminist speaks up against the genocide in Tibet? Because the holy cow of abortion is worship.
When a woman decides that she is not... When a woman...
through abortion.
Thank you. When a woman decides she's not in a position to be a mother and chooses to abort her child, if she's then forced, as many have been done, to have the children, where are you when these children are born? When they're taken into orphanages, where's your so-called moral upstanding?
Providing
You're not providing jack
providing homes,
because
providing
these children are suffering in orphanages.
You totally don't know what women are doing for women.
And you sit here judging women,
you choose to judge
their own rights to be able to judge for themselves what's right for them. So I'm sorry. You need to get over yourself.
I've stood there and supported women who felt that they had no choice but to have but to abort a child, and then they received their help and their child was saved.
I did my best to say nothing for as long as possible.
We need to live in our spiritual dignity and not betray ourselves.
For that. The debates will continue on Twitter. I can't wait to see that. Next week, we're in Salford. Do join us then. For now, it's goodbye. Have a great Sunday. Thank you. Thank you so much.